Welcome to the Combat Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Peacock. My guest today is Matt Thornton, a 4th degree black belt in BJJ, founder of Straight Blast Gym International, and an influential thinker in the world of martial arts training methodology. In this episode, Matt talks about the concept of aliveness in training and how you can start to train with aliveness immediately, even as a total beginner. He also explains why he does not believe there is any such thing as an advanced technique and what that means for curriculum design. Whether you're a traditional or modern martial artist, I'm confident there's something here for you to learn. And if you've struggled to understand how to teach with aliveness without resorting to all-out free sparring, you definitely don't want to miss this episode. So if you're excited to dive in, hit the subscribe button on your podcatcher now. Welcome to the Combat Learning Podcast. I'm really excited to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So I've followed you for probably quite a few years now. I remember back in the Bullshido days when that was a big thing on the internet. It's kind of fizzled out now, following a lot of the stuff they used to write about you there. And I know in the early days of YouTube, when it was pretty wild. It was pretty wild on the early days of YouTube. So I remember that a lot of people, while you were, I guess, preaching aliveness at those days, I remember that a lot of people on YouTube were trying to take pot shots at you and say this and that. And I don't know. It was a wild time, but yeah, I remember all the way back in like the mid to late 2000s. Following some of the stuff that you were writing on the internet and some of the videos that you appeared in. I think it was the later 2000s.
Yeah.
So it's awesome to actually finally get to, after all these years, get to talk to you.
Well, yeah. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, no problem. So I don't want to focus on aliveness proper too much because I think it's been covered quite a bit. But I do have a mixed audience. So if you could actually go over real quick what aliveness is for their sake, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So early on in my martial arts career, so right now we're probably talking about 30 plus years ago, I was obsessed with the question of what works and what doesn't work in martial arts. And that led me to training in different martial arts, to boxing, and eventually to Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and mixed martial arts, which is what my organization focuses on now. But in the early days, as I was transitioning away from the Jeet Kune Do community and towards what SBG does now, I came up with the term aliveness as a kind of catch-all way of explaining to people why things work and why things don't work. Because the questions that would constantly come up would be, what about this style? Or why doesn't this technique work? And martial arts, like the scientific process, like anything functional, what matters most is not the answer, but the way you arrived at that answer. Not the conclusion, but how you arrive at the conclusion. And in martial arts, that means it's not the technique, but how you train the technique that matters. And training with aliveness makes all the difference in the world. So for something to be alive, it has to have timing, energy, and motion. So it's not going to be in a contrived pattern. If it's in a contrived pattern, you'll never get timing, and then you won't be able to apply it against a resisting opponent. It has to be moving around as things do in an unpatterned way. And there has to be that energy, that resistance you get from an opponent that's realistic. And timing, energy, and motion are basically three ways of looking at the same object. And if that is missing from a drill, then the drill by definition won't be alive. And the key to being good at fighting, if that's what you're trying to get good at, is to spend as much time doing alive training as possible. So that was my early message in martial arts. That was the thing that I think I became known for and the thing that I wanted to promote the most. And then from there, the conversation turned more towards, well, how do you train alive in a practical sense? Because people would mistake that for thinking that we meant sparring, or thinking that as if aliveness is synonymous with sparring. That'd be a common one. A very common thing was, well, you can't just throw people in the deep end of the pool. And they had this kind of idea that we meant rough, full contact. And that's not what aliveness means at all.
Right.
So people who understand the concept can then apply that concept to literally anything in physical combat and create a drill. Any of our SBG coaches would be able to create a drill on the spot where you would be able to train someone pretty much regardless of their physical limitations or background, just somebody that was older or somebody that was not in shape, in a way that was healthy and not counterproductive, and yet still would be able to advance their skills. So that's what live training is all about.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a perfect segue. So you mentioned that some people, when they first come into contact with that concept, their reaction is, their sort of knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, you can't just throw them in the deep end, or you can't make them spar all the time because their bodies will break down. So,
Right.
and like you said, that's a misunderstanding. And I hear it quite a bit when I talk to, I have actually a Taekwondo background. I do a lot of jujitsu these days, but I have a Taekwondo background. And one of the things that I'm into is not necessarily making Taekwondo into a self-defense system, but being able to build athletes that can compete in Olympic Taekwondo better, right? Because I think Aliveness can really help with the sport aspect of Taekwondo fighting.
Yeah.
And what I hear from people when I say, hey, look, if you want to build really good spars, if you really want to have any inkling of an ability to transfer any of that to like kickboxing, then you need to be using Aliveness. And that's the response I get. Hey, you can't just toss them in there. They're going to get injured. They're going to get hurt. They're going to get demoralized. So my question to you is, how do you usually respond to that challenge?
Well, I mean, if it's sincere in the sense, it just means that they just don't understand what we're talking about. So I'd take the time, as long as it's a sincere question, I really don't mind taking the time to explain to them what that means. And the simplest way to explain it is what we call the I method. So it's a 3-step process. So introduce, isolate, and integrate back into the whole. So if you're talking about Taekwondo, for example, and you were going to teach a kick to someone that didn't know the kick at all, then of course you would introduce the fundamental things that they need to be able to apply the kick, the base, their stance, introduce the kick, and they would practice the technique without any resistance, hitting a pad or hitting a target or just doing it correctly in the air. And that's what we call the introduction stage of training. And the goal of that stage is to get the person to be able to mechanically repeat the movement correctly. So without any pressure, there's no pressure put on them. They're not actually trying to hit someone, but just be able to mechanically do it correctly. And speaking about something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example, to give a concrete example, if I was showing a headlock escape, then the first thing I would do is I'd have them get into that position. And I would show them the mechanics of the movement that we're teaching for them to escape, and make sure that everybody in the room can do it correctly. And if you're a good coach and you know what to focus on, and you're focused on fundamentals, and that's another big part of the SBG curriculum. But what we teach is fundamentals, and that's the sole focus of our curriculum, certainly my curriculum. If you're focused on those fundamentals and you know them, then I think an average room of brand new people should be able to repeat what you're teaching mechanically correct in 5 to 10 minutes. It doesn't take a long time. And if it does take a long time, then it's probably something you should break up into smaller parts, or simplify for the audience. So once they can all do it mechanically correct, then we want to drill with timing. We need to develop timing. The difference between a black belt in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and a blue belt in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu isn't knowledge of technique, but as Hickson has said many times before, it's that timing. And you only get timing through a live drilling. That is the key point. So you can have that person kick a heavy bag or kick a Macawire pad or kick a focus mitt 1,000 times, but they're not going to get timing unless they're doing it in a live way. So the next stage is what we call isolation. And we isolate that tool, whatever it is, a kick, a headlock, escape, against adaptive resistance. Adaptive resistance meaning the resistance can start out very light in the beginning, where they're successful the majority of the time, and then we progressively add more, just as you progressively add weight to the bar when you're weightlifting. You don't start, with 1,000-pound squat. You work your way to it. And we use the term adaptive because sometimes we will dial the resistance back, and sometimes we will turn the resistance up depending on what you see the student how they're performing, the athlete's performing. And that's where we spend the majority of our time. So if it's an hour-long class, you'd spend 5 or 10 minutes introducing the technique, and then we'd probably spend at least a half hour drilling it. And drilling is to me where the real art of coaching comes in. And all of our drills are alive. So nothing that we call a drill in SPG is just rote repetition of a technique. It's not a dead pattern. Right. It's not form. And then once we finish that stage, then often we add the third stage, which is integration. And that means you take that piece of the game, whatever game you're working, whether it was Taekwondo or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or firearms training or boxing or whatever it is, and we put it back into the whole, put it back into the theater of operation that you're training for. So, you put that kick, that might be the part where you would do some level appropriate sparring and try and add the tool into it. In jiu-jitsu, that might be the part at the end of the class where the students start in a headlock, but then they can just roll to submission. And that's just basically the headlock becomes a starting point for them. Mm-hmm. And, that stage can get bigger in terms of time or smaller depending on the group we're working with. But that is a 3-step process: introduce, isolate, integrate. And what people have to understand is when we talk about the word drill, we're always talking about drilling with aliveness. And there is nothing on earth that's too dangerous to drill with aliveness. And in the hands of a competent coach who knows what they're doing, there's absolutely no reason people need to get hurt. So this is something you can do with kids. It's something you can do with elderly people. I have students in their 70s. Aliveness is really for everybody.
Awesome. Yeah. And that's really what I've come to understand over the years. There's not a lot of, and I know you've mentioned this elsewhere, but once you start sparring and even doing positional sparring or technical sparring where you can actually interact honestly and genuinely with an opponent, the rote training becomes really boring, and it's like, yeah, okay, so you needed a little bit to get yourself scaffolded to that live drilling, but it's not. You get bored unless you're like a kata athlete and that's just your thing. For the regular people that want to stay in shape, the most interesting, fun part where you're actually getting a good workout and not feeling like you're trying to deadlift 600 pounds is when you're sparring.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, my experience has been once people are exposed to live training, it's very hard to go back to train, in a dead pattern, more traditional way because it's boring. And you also have the recognition that by comparison, you're really wasting time in terms of how much faster you would acquire skill by training alive. It's very hard to go back to training the other way.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's for me personally. I don't do traditional Taekwondo classes anymore. I have a buddy, and they have a sparring class on the weekends, and that's when when I'm able to get up there, that's where I'm going to be, because I don't really. Sometimes I do forms just for me, because I kind of like to do them sometimes, but for the most part, like I don't really want to sit in an hour-long class with a master scrutinizing my every move, because that's just not the skill set that I want to build, and I don't. I don't want to do these. Definitely don't want to do one steps. I cut that out a long time ago. It's for me, it's boring. It's not interesting anymore. I spent most of my life doing that stuff. I started martial arts when I was like 9, and I'm, about to be 30. So it's not interesting to me. And I think that if you want to have adult students, whether you're jiu-jitsu or Taekwondo or really anything, having that aspect where you can actually interact with a partner with aliveness and genuinely be building something and struggling with another human being in some way is going to be really good for your retention as long as you frame it correctly. And I was wondering what tips you had for preparing or framing somebody who's going to be signing up at your school. There's going to be a lot of aliveness, and just letting them know what they're in for along their learning journey.
Yeah, so we have at all the SPGs, we have what's called a foundations class. So when they first sign up, everybody goes through this program, and it's a fixed amount of classes. Right now it's 18, although we're probably going to be expanding that. So, and they take it 2 days a week. So you're talking about it's a 6-week program essentially. And part of that class, I mean, we're showing them techniques and we're showing them self-defense things and we're trying to give them the picture of where we go. But part of it too is to expose them to our culture, to our training methods, so that they understand what they're going to be doing, why they're going to be doing what they're doing, why we use the kind of epistemology that we do, where it came from, all that kind of stuff. So by the time they graduate from that class, they get into what we call combat athlete class, a regular class that they'll be in for the rest of their life. They've had exposure to those concepts and they kind of understand where we're going. And I think that's a very important part of running a successful gym. If I had to pick one word, just one word to encapsulate what you need most to run a successful gym, that word would be culture. And as the head coach or owner of the gym, your hardest job and probably most important job is maintaining a healthy, vibrant culture, and having a good introduction program and making sure that you take the time with your staff to sit down and talk to every new student that comes in and explain to them why you do what you do and why your facility trains the way it does. Not only will that greatly increase your retention, but it solves a lot of these problems down the road because people kind of have an idea in their mind of where they're going.
Awesome. Very helpful. I wanted to circle back to the adaptive aspect of your drilling. And I was wondering if it's just about moderating pressure, or if there's actually an element where you'll change the nature of the drill or change the drill if a student needs more or less. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So there's a huge variety of drills, and it's really only limited by your creativity. But if we talk about conceptually types of drills, there's really only 5 types of alive drills. And example of that would be a pocket drill. A pocket drill, as we define it, is a drill that focuses on a particular range or a particular distance. So you could be working anything. You could be working jiu-jitsu, you could be working boxing, you could be working taekwondo. It doesn't matter. But your goal as a coach with the student at that moment is to focus on a particular range, maintaining it, or being able to defend yourself within that range, whatever it is, it's about that range. And so the drill that you're going to be doing, the students maintain that particular distance. Another drill might be focused more on the actual objective. You're focused on passing the guard, or you're focused on escaping a headlock. Another drill might be focused on a particular movement or way to achieve that objective, where we're isolating a particular technique, and that would be an isolation drill. Sometimes we're focused more on transitions, moving between different techniques or even different objectives. And there we'd have what we call a call-out drill, where the coach will rapidly have the student change strategy or change technique mid-drill so that they can develop some flow. It goes on from there. There's basically 5 types of drills, and any kind of drills someone creates or that I've ever seen is usually one, or very often a combination of 2 or 3 of those principles. And once you understand those 5 principles for creating drills, you should be able to take any skill, any technique, anything physical that you want to impart to someone else, and be able to come up with a functional, safe, effective, alive drill right on the spot.
Nice. Awesome. And it's definitely crucial to, if you're an instructor, especially coming from a traditional background, and your familiarity with drills is basically just to randomly cobble something together, or just really to take stuff that other people have made. When you step into the arena of building your own drills, and you actually want to have a principled approach, that seems to me the most accessible way to do it, is really to map out the types of drills you have, the types of skills and techniques you want to target, and then just to matrix it in a way and build these targeted drills instead of just oh, I want to do this, and I'm just gonna, toss these three elements in and hope it works, right?
Absolutely.
um, yeah, and so my question is, eh, so if you've put a drill together, and one of the partners maybe is a little newer and they're really struggling with the intensity, how do you help the two partners understand, or really the more aggressive partner understand, where the level they need to be at to help be more conducive of learning to a partner that's maybe too overwhelmed in that drill?
Sure. So that's a very common problem, and that we all run into as teachers and coaches. And that goes back to culture. So, very early on in the process, from the moment the students walk into my gym at SBG, we are trying to teach them how to be good training partners. And the culture is such from the top down with my staff and with my coaching staff that if you are more skilled and more advanced and you're kind of shutting down a student or dominating them in a way that's unproductive, nobody in the gym is going to look at you like you're cool for doing that. And very quickly the people learn to adapt or they just quit because
Mhm.
our goal is to make everyone a good training partner for everybody else. And the students very early on learn to then take some pride in being a good training partner, being the kind of training partner other people want to train with. And the reason why other people want to train with you, number one, they're not worried that you're going to hurt them. And that's the most important thing. But number two is you're capable of dialing that intensity up and down depending on where it needs to go in a way that's healthy and productive for your training partner. And that's a skill like any other skill that takes time to learn. Some people struggle with that more than others because they have trouble relaxing. And they could just, have too much nervous energy or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And in those cases, then as a coach, you may have to pair those people up with someone else who's capable of handling that. Um, and spend more time with those students because ultimately our goal would be that they're ultimately going to have to learn how to be good training partners. But from a jujitsu perspective, by the time someone gets to be about purple belt, it's very, very rare that they have any of that um, wasted frenetic energy left in them. Usually by the time they get to be a purple belt, they've learned how to relax. But for most people, that takes 5 to 6 years. So it is a process that we begin from day one and work on with the students for the rest of their career.
Great. Awesome. So are there any coaching cues that you use to help guide students learn that control?
Yeah, I mean, it's unproductive to yell at them to relax
Right.
because, it's an impossible thing to do. So the first thing is you got to model the behavior. So you yourself have to be relaxed when you're on the mat, relaxed when you're demonstrating the technique. And probably even more importantly, the senior students in the gym, the ones who are, because as a coach, you're not going to be teaching, you're not going to be training in your own class. Your job is to maintain the safety of that mat. So you're going to be on the sidelines. So the people that are really going to be modeling the behavior that you want to see are going to be the students who have been there longer, that all the other students are looking up to. And it's very important that those students are very relaxed and demonstrating the techniques and practicing the techniques and drilling in a relaxed way. So that when you have a brand new white belt or let's say a very new blue belt, and they look at the purple belts or the brown belts or the black belts training on the mat, they see purple belts, brown belts, and black belts who are smooth and who are calm. And what becomes the definition of being technical and being good is being smooth and being calm, not being aggressive and wasting energy. And again, that goes back to the culture. It starts day one in the foundations class when we prep them. That is the idea of jujitsu. Everything is based on efficiency and not wasting energy. So we're always trying to accomplish our goal with as little energy, muscle, and risk as possible. So everything really is we try to do calmly and relaxed. And because you've built a culture like that, people will then aspire to achieve that. And there are definitely people who struggle with that more than others. And as a coach, you have to try and work with them. But everything in your gym, from the foundations class to how you describe the drill, to how you demonstrate the drill, to how the senior students and coaches drill when the drill is going on, everything in your gym should model that ideal of being relaxed and being calm. And then if they still can't get it, I will interject very quickly, and I will have a conversation with them. I'll talk to them about it. I'll explain why it's important. And if they still can't get it, then I will put them with one of the more senior students who I know can handle that energy.
Mm-hmm.
And they will stick with that student until they learn how to calm down.
Yeah, definitely. Are you trying to pair white belts with upper belts as soon as possible so they can start to feel that energy for themselves?
We are. In the foundations class, we don't have them rolling. So they're not going to actually roll. I found very little use to have two brand new white belts rolling against each other.
Yeah.
Number one, there's a lot of room for accidental injury.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, the worst thing that can happen is one of them will be successful doing something stupid with the other one because neither knows what they're doing. And then you have a habit that you've created that you have to break later on.
Yeah.
So, but they've been at the gym for 2 or 3 months before we let them roll. And then when they begin rolling, they roll with one of the more senior students. So they're going to be rolling right away with either the instructor or people who are much better than them. And then as they, advance to like mid white belt in my gym, then they start rolling with other people their own level. But that helps smooth out a whole bunch of that, because when you have a school where they roll on day one and worst, they have brand new people rolling with brand new people on day one. Not only is it going to be there's going to be a high volume of injury there, but I think you actually slow down the learning curve of the students because so often they acquire bad habits. This is particularly true if you have strong athletic guys. Will develop. It'll take them much longer to become good black belts, just because they wind up using way too much of their own physicality at the lower belt, and that becomes a habit that's very hard to break.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but representativeness is big in the motor learning literature. And there's a way in which if you have two white belts, and it's the same thing in Taekwondo, sparring each other, it's deceptively not representative of the real performance context. So if you were to step into a tournament where everyone's been training for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, it's going to be a lot different than if you're sparring a white belt that's been there for less than a month. It's just going to be very different. So I guess one thing I wanted to clarify is, so you said they're not rolling during that introductory period, but they are doing more isolated aliveness type of drills.
Correct. Okay. They are training with aliveness on day one, but we're just not having them do an all-out roll to submission.
Okay.
If they really want to do that, if they want to experience jujitsu, sometimes people kind of want to see the magic of it. The instructor is more than free to roll with them, and that happens sometimes. They'll grab them after class or roll with them a little bit during class so that they can understand the reality of what we're doing. But what they're not doing is grabbing another brand new person and wrestling to submission.
Yeah, that seems like a really great way to approach that. It's not to let them do the free sparring and start doing wonky stuff, but to kind of force them into an environment where they have to come up with solutions to techniques that they're actually going to find in the performance environment. So that's awesome. I think that's a really big deal for people who don't understand how to properly apply aliveness into their training such that you can be alive from day one instead of waiting 3 months to get into any sort of aliveness drilling. And I keep saying aliveness drilling because I know that a lot of my audience are going to think drilling in the sense of something that's dead or just a repetition. Because you do even find that in jiu-jitsu a lot too, like flow drills where it's scripted and more of an exercise in cardio than it is in your perceptual motor skills. Um, but with the actual, it's important to understand, like you said, that the drilling is actually alive. It's
Right.
honest. It's unscripted and uncooperative. Um, but yeah, so one thing that pops up into my mind is, or actually a question is it possible to create a drill that seems alive but is too isolated in some sense? Have you ever seen a situation where it's actually the dynamics, too many dynamics or too many elements are actually removed, and it's not, even though there's an unscripted and uncooperative element that is actually probably not helpful to your overall game?
Uh, I could see where it's not as helpful to your overall game, but as long as
Hmm.
you're training with some form of where what you're doing is alive, even
Hmm.
isolating tiny movements, steps, or movements that you make, anything like that, can I find can be very helpful.
Hmm.
So we will isolate sometimes the tiniest part of a particular movement and just drill that in order to get better and smoother at that particular piece of the game.
Okay.
If you do too much, then you and the student are going to look at each other and go, I think I have this part. Why don't we build on that? And you always have to take into account time management. I mean, most students and most people um, only train 2 days a week on average, right? If you have somebody who's truly dedicated, maybe they train 4 days a week. But most people have jobs and they have lives and they have families, and so 2 to 3 days a week is consistently for a number of years is what you normally get out of people. And
Right.
in that time, you're going to get maybe 2 hours a night, right? Maybe three if you're in really great shape. But for the average person, actual physical training, it's probably going to be about 2 hours. And so you have to think, what is the best use of that time? And you want to maximize that time. You want to be efficient with your time, and you want to get as much out of that as humanly possible. A lot of people think that the best way to get the most out of that time is to just roll. It's very common in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Hmm.
I disagree with that. I think the best use of that time is to drill, and so does Hickson. And Hickson's talked about this for years. And what we call drilling in SPG, most Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools will call positional sparring.
Yeah.
But regardless of the term that you use, I think that's the most use of your time. And given time constraints, isolating just a small part over and over and over again, probably not going to be efficient use of your time. So we're going to expand it. But as far as being a waste of time, as long as you're training with aliveness, your body is acquiring timing, and it's hard to waste time uh, ever as long as you're getting timing out of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Excellent. Um, yeah. So adaptive drilling was the main concept I wanted to cover, but there's a couple things I think that are tangentially related to what we're talking about. And um, you've made a claim before that there are no beginner and advanced techniques. And as a Taekwondo guy, when I first heard this, I was like trying to come up with a million counter examples. But um, if eventually I kind of realized that there's a schizophrenia in a lot of martial arts, but I like to use Taekwondo because it's the one I'm the most familiar with, where there's a certain hierarchy to your training and your formal training, that is entirely divorced from what is required in the performance context. In this case, sparring. So, for context, in Taekwondo, you like something like a back kick is something that you won't learn until, you know 6 to 8 months down the way. That's a blue belt move. That's a green belt move. But in sparring, which you might be doing before that time, a back kick is, in certain situations within the economy of the rule set of Olympic Taekwondo, is an essential tool, especially a counter tool, um, that allows you to score and counter certain attacks and score without being scored on. So it seems to me that that it's actually in the realm of Taekwondo that a back kick, if you're talking about Taekwondo as a sport, is not an advanced technique because it's something that you need to know immediately. right?
Right.
And so I wanted you to explain what you meant by basically flattening the technique hierarchy and saying that everything really is there are no such thing as advanced techniques. What is it? What do you mean by that? And how did you come to that conclusion? Hey guys, real quick before the episode continues. If you're wondering how you can supercharge your training in a way that helps you actually perform better on the mat or in the ring, I've got the perfect thing for you. I've taken the scientific concept known as transfer of learning and distilled it down into a handful of dead simple, easy to understand rules you can use to supercharge your training today. And the best part is that it almost always makes training more fun, not less. Now you don't have to spend hours and hours of drilling just to fail when your practice gets tested in sparring or competition. Instead, you can take these simple rules and transform your drills and exercises into rapid skill-building machines. Your classmates and training partners won't believe your progress. And if you're an instructor, your students will get better faster than ever and have more fun while doing it. Go to combatlearning.com/transfer to sign up to our email list and grab your transfer cheat sheet now. Plus, you'll never miss an episode and get access to exclusive tips. And just to say thanks, I'll send you my Introduction to Motor Learning for Martial Arts PDF so you can get up to speed on the powerful concepts we're discussing on this podcast. So go to combatlearning.com/transfer now to get your cheat sheet and other goodies. That's combatlearning.com/transfer, TRANSFER.
Sure. I mean that very literally, and it goes back to what I meant when I talked about our curriculum being based on fundamentals. So what people often do when they think about martial arts is they think in terms of technique. So if we use Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as an example, they'll think in terms of omoplata or a triangle or rear naked choke, and they say, well, what about a scissor sweep? Is that a advanced technique or is that a fundamental? But that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about fundamentals. So when I talk about fundamentals, I'm talking about the structure, the infrastructure that underlies every good, legitimate jiu-jitsu black belt. Each black belt will have his or her own style, which is unique and individual, just like every MMA fighter will have their own style, unique and individual, and that's something you earn over time. Mm-hmm. But underlying that, the skeletal framework that propels that athlete to be good, underneath that are principles and movements that all those athletes share. And those are fundamentals. And fundamentals, by definition, are going to transcend venue. So it'll be, if it's a true fundamental in jiu-jitsu, it's going to be a fundamental when you're doing gi. It's going to be a fundamental when you take the gi off. It's going to be a fundamental in the MMA cage. It's going to be a fundamental if you get in a fight going to your car. It will transcend body type. It won't matter if you're 130 pounds and female or 260 pounds and overweight, or if you're 60 or 30. If it's the most efficient way to mechanically do something, that doesn't magically change when you age or grow or change gender. So it'll transcend body, it will transcend venue, it'll transcend time. If it is the most efficient way to cut off the blood supply to someone's head now, then it was during the time of the Egyptians as well, and it will be in 1,000 years from now. And it transcends geography, which is why there is so much cultural affectation with martial arts. But if I said to you, hey, we're going to go work on Canadian geometry, everybody would understand right away that that was ridiculous. And yet we're constantly talking about Brazilian jiu-jitsu or Japanese jiu-jitsu or Chinese kung fu. If you apply a scientific approach to martial arts, that is equally silly. So underlying all good grappling, whether we're talking about wrestling or jiu-jitsu or judo or any of it, will be the same fundamentals. You'll see the same fundamentals for a good hip throw in Greco-Roman wrestling, in judo, in jiu-jitsu, in Mongolian wrestling. The list goes on, and pretty much every warrior culture on the planet has a grappling art that's native to it, and most of those contain some kind of hip throw or backstep. And the fundamentals of making that throw work mechanically are the same because they're based in science. And so what we look for in SPG with our curriculum are those fundamentals that underlie what really defines good stand-up clinching ground. And that's what we teach. And we try and teach that with as little of the cultural affectations attached and as scientifically as possible, and focus on just that. And my experience has been that when the students are taught just that in the class, all the other stuff, the fancy bells and whistles and the parsley on the plate that everybody likes to obsesses over, they make that shit up on their own anyway. When they're rolling, they'll come up with their own little weird techniques. They can go on YouTube and they can see that. But the real heart of what allows them to survive and defend and be able to deal with somebody bigger and stronger than them, the efficiency that allows for that are the fundamentals that underlie all that, the base posture, connection, and pressure that makes jiu-jitsu work. And that's what I mean when I say there's no beginning or advanced technique.
Excellent. So for you, in your mind, a fundamental is less a specific technique and more, how can I say this without being too abstract? So you were talking about connection and posture. So fundamentals is more about the structure of how you move, where you place yourself, how you place yourself in a given situation.
Correct. So, for me, jiu-jitsu is the easiest to explain it. So when I talk about jiu-jitsu and I talk about fundamentals, the analogy I often use is a tree. So you have your base, which are the roots of the tree. And that is very literally your connection to the ground. So how your base, your where your weight is seated and your connection to the earth itself. Then you have your posture, that's the trunk of the tree, and that is in a very literal way the relationship of your body in relation to your opponent's body. And if you have good base and you put yourself in the correct posture, your body in relationship to the other person's body, you will have, depending on how you adjust, more leverage or less leverage. And we're looking to have as much leverage as possible so we can be efficient. And then from a particular base and posture, roots and trunk of the tree, there will be directions you can apply force. There's never less than 2 and usually no more than 5. And those are like the main branches that come off that tree. So now you have base, posture, and pressure. And from that springs an infinite amount of branches. And those are the techniques. Those are submissions and sweeps and turnovers and all the different techniques. And those will sprout and they'll go counter for counter. And that continuously evolves and grows as that tree continually expands. But what underlies all those branches and all that fruit is the base, the trunk of the tree, and the main branches. So what I like to focus on when I'm teaching jiu-jitsu is the base, posture, and pressure. Connection is the part of the tree right where the trunk branches off into the main branches, right where posture becomes pressure. Right before posture becomes pressure, there is a moment where you can maximize your connection, and that dramatically increases your efficiency. And that particular aspect of jiu-jitsu comes very much from Rickson Gracie's thinking and exploration and teaching. So that's kind of from his line of jiu-jitsu. You won't find that usually discussed in the other Gracie Jiu-Jitsu family or the other Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools. Although, by definition, when you see someone who is truly great at jiu-jitsu, and Roger Gracie immediately comes to mind, and you see him executing something fantastic, if you really understand what Roger's doing, you could very well summarize the difference between Roger's technique and many other people's techniques as that better connection.
Awesome. So you inevitably kind of come to a problem like trying to figure out which variation of a given, like the mechanics of a given technique you want to teach, because sometimes there's different variations of doing the same technique. How do you go about choosing which one you want to use as your base variation? Or maybe you don't have a base variation.
Yeah, underlying any base variation of the technique will be the base, right? So my focus would be on the base, the posture, the connection, and the pressure. And then maybe after focusing on that and spending time on that and drilling that, I would show multiple variations and let the students pick. If I think there's one variation that's more efficient than the other one, that's probably going to be the one I'm going to go to. Generally, what's most efficient is also simpler, usually.
Yeah.
So easier to apply, less steps, not as complicated. You're not,
Hmm.
passing the key back between 4 different grips or having to change, like that. But you could take something like, for example, uh, think about a butterfly hook sweep, right?
Hmm.
Very simple, very fundamental sweep of jujitsu. There are many variations of that sweep, many different grips that you can take, whether you have a gi on or you're not wearing a gi. Different postures you can apply the sweep from, whether you're sitting in an upright guard or you're further on your back. So there's all kinds of variations of a butterfly hook sweep, and all kinds of different jujitsu instructors will have different ways of applying that sweep and different ways of teaching that sweep. But if you really understand how the sweep works, then you will see that at the core of what they're doing, they're all essentially achieving the same thing by doing very similar things with their base, with
Hmm.
their posture, and with their connection to their opponent. Sometimes the shoulder will be replaced by a grip with a gi, or sometimes the hip will become the shoulder. It'll change shapes and forms, but underlying the mechanics of that butterfly hook sweep, if you really understand the art, if you understand the sweep, then you'll be able to see the base, the posture, and the connection. And then the different angles. Usually, one of the more important things about pressure is the angle at which you apply it. So the different angles that you're applying the sweep to, and then the variations kind of become less important. And what you want to pass on to your students is that deeper understanding of the sweep. Let them come up with their own variations. Because my experience has been that no two black belts in jiu-jitsu will ever roll the same way. And that's as it should be. Everybody has their own unique personality, and they're going to have their own way of doing jiu-jitsu on the mat. So what I'm interested in as a coach, and what I try and spend my time on teaching, is just the things that they have in common.
Awesome. Yeah. With I guess applying that to striking, it's more about positioning yourself in the right place first, and then having the ability to pivot and press your body behind your strike. Um, Obviously, that's less attached than most of what you're going to do in jujitsu. You do have a striking background, I believe. And how would you, if you were to translate that into terms for strikers, how would you do that?
Yeah, same thing. So with striking, you're talking about, distance becomes extremely important, managing
Hmm.
distance. And then when you're talking about power, you're talking about body mechanics. And the power from a right elbow or a good right kick, a right cross, once you understand how to maximize power when you're throwing a rear punch or a lead punch, a hook punch or a straight punch, the variation of whether we're talking about Muay Thai or we're talking about boxe française savate or we're talking about Western boxing, they don't seem to matter that much, right?
Hmm.
And you can have styles as distinct as Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali, or Mike Tyson and Lennox Lewis, and they're very, very different styles of boxing. But they're still using the same 5 punches, maybe different emphasis, but they're the same 5 punches, the same essential body mechanics, and applying them at the same ranges. They have different ranges. They prefer different choice of those 5 tools they prefer. But mechanically, right, the distance, the footwork, the body mechanics, all that, the timing, all that stuff they have in common, which is what allows them to be great boxers and professional boxers. And so with boxing, it's very much the same. If I was going to coach a boxer, I would want to focus on the fundamentals of distance and good footwork and power and the ability to put together combinations. And then through sparring, let that boxer discover their own style, because the worst thing you can do as a coach is try and make another boxer box in a way that they're not meant to box. An example I use this all the time is Marvis Frazier, who was Joe Frazier's son and who was a really good boxer back in the day, and but he was a more of a longer range boxer. He was a boxer that preferred jabs and crosses and staying out on the outside and kind of a stick and move, more like Sugar Ray Leonard type boxing. And
Yeah.
his dad came in and started coaching him. And his dad was obviously not that kind of boxer. His dad was more of a Mike Tyson, bob and weave, overhook, overhand left in Joe's case, overhand right. And he tried to have his son use the style he uses, and ended his son's career. And so that would be my example of coaches interfering too much by getting too specific in the kinds of techniques that you're doing, as opposed to just sticking with the fundamentals. If you stick with the fundamentals and you have an environment where the athlete can train live, they will develop their own style. And problems like, well, which variation should they use, or should she use or not use, solve themselves, because the athlete will figure it out in
Yeah.
the alive theater.
Yeah. So what you're advocating for, and I definitely agree, is that you're not trying to give your students an encyclopedia of a technique, its base variation, and all of its possible variations, like a catalog, which you'll find a lot of in traditional martial arts. But I've also come across a lot of jujitsu guys that just like to collect techniques and variations.
Yeah.
Instead, what you're trying to do is give them just enough to place them in an environment where that personal style can emerge on its own as a result of exploration.
That's exactly right. I think that's a very good way of putting it.
That's interesting. I have a question that's more personal interest to me, and that is because of what you talk about, especially the way you structure it. Sounds so familiar to my studies in motor learning and motor control. Have you studied a lot of motor learning? Have you looked at anything like representative learning design or the constraints-led approach? Is this mostly just you experimenting on your own over the years? What has contributed to your thoughts?
Yeah, I read quite a bit, but if I'm being honest with you, I don't read that much related to sports or biomechanics, and I haven't studied it outside of my own teaching. So, but I've been teaching full now for 28 years. This has been my only job. I've had the great privilege of working with a lot of great coaches, worked with a lot of professional athletes, wrestlers and MMA fighters and boxing coaches over the years. So my experience has just been from passing the art on and constantly trying to improve my own teaching. And part of what SBG is all about as an organization is, I'm not the only one like that. There's every other coach in the organization, whether it's John Kavanagh in Ireland or Adam Singer or Chris Conley in the South, or whoever, all the different coaches, John Frankel in Korea. They're always trying to not just better themselves, but also better the teaching methods. More importantly, refine the epistemology, and make everything we do even more scientific and more efficient for our students, so that every generation that comes through our organization gets better than the one that was before. And so I have the great benefit of being, in a position where I'm surrounded by a lot of coaches like that. We all communicate with each other all the time about what we're doing. And our newest member of SBG that joined recently was Henry Akins, and Henry's a fantastic jiu-jitsu coach who had the benefit of many, many years training with Hickson, when I think Hickson was at his peak as far as teaching, when Hickson was really explaining things like connection. And so Henry brings a wealth of that to the organization as well. But when I watch Henry teach and I talk to him about it, it's the same thing. He's constantly trying to make himself a better instructor. So as an organization, we have just a group of instructors who are constantly trying to better our training methods and what we do. And to be quite honest, when I started this 30 years ago, there was nobody else that I could have modeled it off of, because MMA didn't exist. So we were the first group of MMA coaches in the world. The closest we could come to was to learn from a wrestling coach, or to learn from a boxing coach, or to learn from my jiu-jitsu instructor. But ultimately, guys like, for example, John Kavanagh, he's the first I think, real generation of true MMA coaches. So, in that sense, all of them are kind of pioneers of the sport.
That's impressive to me, because when you talk about allowing a personal style to emerge in a sparring environment, that just, it sounds like the ecological approach, or ecological dynamics is what it's called. And the way that you structure your drilling sounds like similar, not exactly the same, but very similar to the constraints-led approach. And the constraints-led approach is kind of a practical framework to apply ecological dynamics, which is very theoretical. And even what I've found is even the constraints-led approach is very broad, very open. Mm-hmm. And your aliveness, timing, energy, and motion, that framework to me seems much more accessible to your average instructor, who already has a deep knowledge of how the game works and just needs a good framework on how to design their drills. I really like it. Like, I don't have to, even broadening my knowledge, or deepening my knowledge of the literature on how humans acquire and develop motor patterns. I don't have to change aliveness. Basically, as you've described it, I don't have to change it at all based on that understanding. And that's what I really like about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it does give people, I think, a just as importantly, a kind of a bullshit detector, a kind of a foolproof bullshit detector for martial arts. Yeah. So you can see that the more clever martial arts con artists will adapt one or two aspects of aliveness, but they'll always be missing an element. A good example of that is Systema. Mm-hmm. So you'll see them doing ridiculous shit, make-believe shit. I think it's quite obvious it's absurd when you watch it, but
yeah,
if you watch very carefully, they're not doing anything in a pattern, and yet it's not alive. And you can see that it's not alive because there's no realistic energy. Nobody's going to ever attack them like that. You know, for them to be able to develop something that would actually be functional, they'd have to be applying what they're doing against a wrestler or against a boxer, and then trying to do it. But of course, that's not what happens. It's always against a 1 and 2 step, somebody that's pretending to throw a punch straight, as it always is. So, you know, once people have an understanding of aliveness, even if they're not ever going to be a coach or a teacher, I think it becomes very hard, if not impossible, to fool them with fake martial arts, which I also think is important.
Definitely. I agree there. And if you don't, it's really easy to hack the human psychology when you have, 18 plus years of traditional education programmed into you. You think that lots of rote learning scaffolding you into quote unquote the real thing, or something that's actually dynamic. You think that's actually quality instruction. You actually think that being given oppressively detailed, highly prescriptive instructions on how to perform a technique from a stylistic standpoint, you think that that's actually good instruction, because you're taught to believe that good instructors are, and you obviously being the general, everyone, you're taught to believe, or conditioned to believe, that the more detail that you can add to something, the better instructor you are. When the reality, in my opinion, is the quality of instruction is more or less where you can expertly direct somebody's attention in the midst of an exercise, and really how you design the exercise itself, the drill, and not really how deep in minute you can get into the weeds on finger placement and on a grip, or how you should flex your toes when you're performing a turning back kick. Those things are things that you pick up naturally, and that you're going to have your own equilibrium for, so to speak, that instructors, while they might have a great understanding on what's around and what might optimize that, are really, they don't need to say, because it's going to be better for their students to develop that and discover it on their own.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah. For me, and that's what I thought when I first started teaching Taekwondo many years ago. I thought I was hot stuff because of the detail that I could go into. and the level of explanation. But especially with teaching kids, what I found was how you design the exercise is a lot more important, because the kids, they'll start doing what you want them to do, or within the ballpark of that, if you design the drill in a certain way. And one thing I learned that really opened my eyes to the power of having a representative or a live type of practice structure was, you spend forever in traditional martial arts learning how to get out of a wrist grab, and in jiu-jitsu you learn all that in one day. So what I did was I just developed these release exercises where you could grab the arm however you wanted to, and one guy had to hold on and he could switch grips, but he had to keep continuous connection, and the other guy had to get out. And the kids got too good at it and got bored at it in one or two classes, and that was it. Like, I was like, wow. And they got good at it. They got way better at that in 10 minutes of an aliveness drill than somebody in a traditional Taekwondo program would have been at releasing a wrist grab after a year or more of training. And one side effect I actually found of it was, with kids in a traditional program, if you grab them outside of a class context and say, "What are you going to do?" they freeze and they forget the technique. But with my students, you could grab them and they'll give you a weird look, but then they do the release, right? They don't freeze.
Yeah.
It's the quality of learning, the transferability of learning is just off the charts.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's been the experience that everybody's had when they, started training with aliveness. And that's why it's virtually impossible to go backwards and imagine training another way. And that aspect that you're talking about of the kids being comfortable when you grab them like that, that is also very important, because by definition, aliveness is always athletic. It doesn't always have to be super intense. Like I said, it can be calm, but it's athletic. And so people become used to having someone put their hands on them, having someone, really try and move them around in a way that's not contrived.
Yeah.
And that is extraordinarily important if you think about teaching people self-defense, or women's self-defense, or self-defense for kids. In many ways, I think something like rugby would be better for a lot of young girls than traditional martial arts, because what I want them to have above all else is confidence in their own body and physicality, and being used to someone putting their hands on them and trying to move them or grab them. And the nice thing about alive training, whether it's jiu-jitsu or judo or wrestling, they get that very quickly and they become accustomed to that. And once a fight turns physical, a street fight or self-defense situation turns physical, their body is going to respond like it does in the alive drilling, and they will be very much at home in that altercation of pushing and pulling, and that the chaos of a fight, because they train with aliveness. And so that aspect of it is extraordinarily important, not just for giving people confidence, but for getting people used to our physical nature as animals.
Right. Yeah, awesome. I think that's probably the main message really of anybody's training in martial arts, is that it just needs to be honestly unscripted, honestly uncooperative, and give you the energy and ability to have timing that you would find in the type of situation that you expect to find yourself in, whether that's self-defense or competition. Yeah. So we've been running on for an hour. I want to be respectful of your time, but where can people go if they want to get in contact with you and kind of follow up and maybe ask more questions?
Sure. So the organization is Straight Blast Gym. StraightBlastGym.com has all of our locations and all the information about the organization. If they're interested in my own personal writing or some of the other things I do, they can go to mattthornton.org, which is my personal website. And then a few years ago, we started our online training university. So we have SBG University. They can link to that through straightblastgym.com, or they can just go to sbguniversity.com. And all my classes that I teach here in Portland, as well as footage goes up every week, multiple videos every single week, in addition to archive of about 800 videos from the last 25 years of Straight Blast Gym. So it's kind of everything you'd want to know as far as training and how we train and what we train, as well as my regular classes I teach here, is available to people now on SBGU if they want to go on there.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you again for coming on. I had a lot of fun, and I hope we can actually do this again sometime.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to the Combat Learning Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. It really helps us out. Finally, this episode, including the intro music, is produced by Micah Peacock. Thanks in advance, and I'll see you on the next episode.